So I'm going to ask you to turn over to Judges chapter 6. We're going to look over the course of the next few minutes. We're going to look at Judges chapters 6, 7, and 8 as we talk about and explore the story of Gideon. Now, Gideon is one of the judges that God raised up during this time period of Israel's history, where they are going through kind of this cycle, if you will, where they will serve and worship God, and then they will fall into idolatry, or they will fall into wickedness in some way. And God will punish them by raising up a nation to oppress them or to take them captive. And as things get bad, the people will cry out to God and ask for His help, at which time He will raise up a judge to deliver them. And that cycle seems to repeat for the people of Israel. Gideon is one of those men that God raised up for the people of Israel. And as we're introduced to Gideon, the nation at this time that is oppressing Israel are the Midianites. And the Midianites are taking the strategy of essentially cutting off the Israelites' food source. They are destroying their cropland. They're destroying all of their agriculture. They're both starving the people in some way, but even more impactfully, they're completely decimating them financially by destroying everything that they relied upon within their financial structure and system. They're destroying their farmland. They're destroying their agricultural system. And when we meet Gideon in Judges chapter 6, that's exactly what's happening. Gideon is in his father's household, and he is threshing wheat. But as he's doing that, we're told that he's trying to hide it. He's trying to do this and hide it quickly so that the nation that's oppressing them, that's trying to confiscate all of their food, can't find that and take it away from him. So he is in his father's household, threshing wheat, and rapidly trying to hide that from those that are seeking to do them harm. That's where we find Gideon. Gideon is an interesting man because of how his story is going to progress from here on out. But one of the first things that I want us to think about in regards to Gideon is just who this man really is at the outset of this story. If you're in Judges chapter 6, I want to read verses 12 through 16 with you. And as we read this, I want you to do two things for me. I want you to identify how Gideon sees himself and what Gideon thinks of himself. And then within this text, we're going to be reading about an angel of the Lord that is sent to him. And I want you to see how God sees Gideon. So how does Gideon see Gideon? How does God see Gideon? Let's begin in verse number 12 of Judges chapter 6. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor." And Gideon said to him, "Oh my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all His miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, 'Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt?' But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites." Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you?" So he said to him, "Oh my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." And the Lord said to him, "Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man." You see the difference? You see the difference in what Gideon thought of himself and the way that God saw Gideon? Who was Gideon? Well, he's a laborer in his father's house. That's where we meet him. He will go on to say that he's from the tribe of Manasseh, which isn't one of the great and mighty tribes. But not only that, he is from the weakest clan within Manasseh, but he's even then going to take it a step further and say, not only am I from the weakest clan in Manasseh, I am the least in my father's house. Gideon essentially is telling us, listen, I am the weakest of the weak. There is nobody weaker than me. But is that how God sees Gideon? How does God see him? You mighty man of valor. You go in your strength and you save your nation. That's how God sees Gideon. Now, those are two very different perspectives looking at the very same man. Gideon sees himself as a nobody. He's looking at the angel of the Lord thinking, you must have gotten the wrong address. The GPS took you the wrong direction. I don't know who you were looking for, but it's not me. The angel of the Lord looks at him and he says, I know exactly who I was coming to find. And it's this mighty man of valor that's standing right in front of me. You see, the interesting thing is that in order to recognize true strength within someone, it requires us to change the lens in which we are looking at them through. Because from a physical perspective, Gideon was right. He was the weakest of the weak. But when viewed through the lens of God, the provider of all strength, he can be seen as a mighty man of valor, a man strong enough to lead his nation out of their bondage. See, I think there's some really important application that we can make to that reality. We are not weak people. We are not helpless people. And it has nothing to do with how strong or feeble we may be physically, because we are people of God's. And when we see ourselves through that lens, that changes our entire perspective. Because now, instead of seeing ourselves as helpless and weak, we can see ourselves as victors and as conquerors. Not because all of a sudden we got so strong and mighty, but because now we are seeing ourselves from the perspective of our Father who is in heaven. And He is the provider of strength. He is the supplier of valor. And it is important as children of His that we learn to see ourselves in that light. We must see ourselves the way that God sees us. Because He has equipped us. That's what Ephesians chapter 6 and the armor of God is all about. God has equipped His people to fight and to be victorious over evil. He has not prepared a group of people to run and to cower. He has given us everything that we need to be victorious and to be mighty and to be strong. And we must see ourselves that way. We must learn to see ourselves the way that God sees us so that we can truly live into the potential that God created us to be. There's another aspect of this story that comes just a little bit later in chapter 7. As now Gideon has taken on the role of leader for the people of Israel, and he is preparing to go to battle against the Midianites. And so as any good leader would prior to going into battle, he is preparing himself and the nation of Israel. He is recruiting. He's wanting to bring in the strongest and the best warriors that the nation could possibly offer so that they can go to war against the Midianites. And so as Gideon recruits and calls in these people, we see in chapter 7, he begins to accumulate these warriors around him. 30,000 men, we're told, that Gideon is able to assemble. Read with me verse number 2 of Judges chapter 7. The Lord said to Gideon, "The people who are with you, they're too many. They're too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, 'My own hand saved me.'" Now, what's interesting is if you go down to verse number 12 of chapter 7, we're given an indication of just how many people they were going to be fighting against. And listen to the language that's used here to describe the Midianite and the Amalekites in verse 12. "Now the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east were lying in the valley, as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as the sand by the seashore in multitude." Now, as the story unfolds, we'll learn that that is at least, it's well above 100,000 warriors that the nation of Israel was getting ready to fight. As numerous as the locusts, numberless nearly. So now all of a sudden, the 30,000 men that Gideon had, and that sounds like a pretty good army, but it starts to sound a little bit small when compared to an army that surpasses 100,000 and is seen as almost countless in number. And yet, God looks down on those 30,000 warriors that Gideon had assembled, and he says, "It's too many. It's too many." Because if 30,000 men go in and they defeat Midian, well, they could just say, they did it. It was all them. Look how powerful they were. Man, Gideon, he really was this great leader of men. And so God begins to whittle that number down. 2 different times, God whittles that number down until he gets down to 300 men. 300 men that are going into battle against an army that is innumerable. So let me ask you this question. Why would God weaken his people? Why would he intentionally take away soldiers from this army? Well, as we read there in verse 2, God recognized that sometimes it's important for his people to be weakened so that they can truly understand where their strength comes from. You see, it was important that the people of Israel know beyond the shadow of a doubt where the victory that they're going to achieve is going to come from. God needed to be sure that there was no way that this nation was going to think that it was their military power that led them to victory. And so he intentionally weakened them. You know, we live in a country in which weakness is frowned upon. Weakness of any sort carries with it a very negative connotation. We're Americans. We are strong. We are powerful. We are the greatest nation in the world. And we take pride in that. Sometimes we need to be humbled and reminded where true strength comes from. And it's not the size of our military. It's not in the strength of our economy. True strength comes only from God. Even personally, on a spiritual level, if I am successful in overcoming temptation, or if as a father and a husband, I am successful at providing for my family, or perhaps I'm successful at standing up for the truth when doing so is difficult, I need to be reminded that it's not my strength to overcome temptation. It's not my ability to provide for my family. It's not my courage and strength to stand up for the truth. I stand on God's strength. I need to be reminded of that sometimes. And in order for that to truly mean what God wants it to mean to us, we need to be humbled. We need to be weakened at times. There's a fascinating example of this in Genesis chapter 11 and the story of the Tower of Babel as that story unfolds for us there. And at that time, the whole world was as one. They all spoke the same language, and they had become mighty and powerful and wealthy, and they decided that they were going to build a tower up to heaven. And God looked down on that and He said, "This is not good. This is not good. They need to be reminded who they are. And they need to be reminded who I am." We need that reminder sometimes. Sometimes that means being weakened or being humbled in different ways. But use those opportunities to remind ourselves that God is the provider of true strength. He is the one who can lead me to victory. He is the one who can give me courage to stand for the truth. It's good for us to be humbled. It's good for us to be humbled for another reason. Because sometimes physical strength of any kind can give us a false sense of security. If you look in Judges chapter 8, now as the battle has unfolded and Gideon and the people of Israel have begun to advance on the Midianite army and those with them, they have begun to chase them and push them back. And many of them have already fallen. But there's an interesting detail that's included for us as Gideon is now in pursuit of those who are running after the initial victory that has taken place. Read with me beginning in verse number 11 of chapter 8. Then Gideon went up by the road of those who dwell in tents on the east of Nobah and Jogbehah, and he attacked the army while the camp felt secure. And when Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued them. And he took the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and routed the whole army. Now, a large number of the Midianites had already fallen at this point. But there were still 15,000 of them. They still dwarfed Gideon and his 300 men that were chasing them. And so even though they were now on the run, they were still able to apparently find an area in which they could set up camp. And they did their best at that time to secure the camp in which they were able to set up. So much so that it's specifically called out here in the verses that we just read that their camp felt secure. They felt as if they had been able to create a stronghold, a place in which they were going to be able to defend themselves and perhaps push Gideon and his army back a little bit. And as if on purpose, because God doesn't do anything on accident, it was when that camp felt secure that God sent Gideon and his men in to rout them. Physical strength can give us a false sense of security. We can experience that on a very personal level with our own health or our own fitness. We can experience that on a spiritual level. But let me just paint a picture for you of what that looks like, specifically from a spiritual perspective. What does it look like to be given a false sense of security due to our own strength? Well, perhaps that may look like, you know what, I can surround myself with some of my best friends who are very, very worldly. But I can put myself in that situation because I'm strong enough to withstand their influence. Now, others, I understand, maybe there may be some people who just, that wouldn't be a good idea for them, but I can do it. I can surround myself day in and day out with very worldly people, and I can withstand that influence. Or, you know what, there are some movies, there are some TV shows that, they got a lot of bad language in, there's a lot of bad things in those, but, I'm mature enough and I'm strong enough. Others maybe not so much. Maybe they should not watch some of those shows, but I can handle that. Or, I know it's good for a lot of people to come together and to worship, 3 times a week and to spend time with each other outside of the assemblies. And, I'll do that when I can, but I've got some other things that I need to spend my time doing, and I can handle that because I'm strong enough, I'm mature enough. I can handle not being around brothers and sisters quite as frequently. Did you hear all the I's in that? All the me's, all the my's. That is the way that we fall into the same trap that Midianites were falling into. Their perceived strength gave them a false sense of security. Our perceived strength can give us a very false sense of security. When I start using I and me and my so much to talk about what I can do, what I can withstand, the influences that I can resist, what I have done is essentially created a me-centric theology. That is idolatry. I have put myself as the supplier of strength in my life. That is idolatry. I have put myself where only God should be. He is my source of strength. He is the one that I must stand on. Not me, because if it's me, no, I'm going to fall victim to these things. I must rely upon God's strength, which means I must cling to Him. And I must seek to be righteous as He is righteous, and holy as He is holy, and love like He loves. And I must hold tight to Him because He is my source of strength. It is so easy for us to fall into this trap as people today, to begin to rely too heavily on ourselves and to forget that if we disconnect ourselves from God, the source of our strength, we are doomed to fail. People of Midian learned that lesson the hard way. You and I have the opportunity to learn from their example and to remember to hold fast to God and to rely upon His strength and His strength alone. And then lastly, as we get near the end of Gideon's story, he has returned from battle a victor. And what he has accomplished on the battlefield is now something of a legend already among the people of Israel. And listen to what is said as he returns home from this great victory. In verse number 22 of Judges chapter 8, then the men of Israel said to Gideon, "Rule over us, both you and your son and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian." Gideon, you are awesome. I don't know how you did it with 300 men, but look at the great victory you have achieved. And thank you so much for relieving us from the oppression of the Midianites. As a reward for that, we want you to rule over us. And not just you, we want your son and your grandson to rule over us as well, because you are mighty. Well, verse number 23 tells us how Gideon responded to that. But Gideon said to them, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." You see, Gideon recognized that it's time to give credit where credit's due. Gideon, he's still that same guy we met in Judges chapter 6. Gideon's not that far removed from timidly threshing wheat in his father's house and trying to hide it from the Midianites so he could have dinner the next day. He's not that far removed from when the angel of the Lord came calling to remind him that I'm from this tribe of Manasseh, this little bitty clan over here, and I'm the weakest and the lowliest in my father's household. You see, even with all that Gideon had accomplished at this point, he was still able to remember that. He was still able to remember that he is really very little. And so when everybody starts pointing at Gideon, Gideon points to God. Brothers and sisters, you and I need to learn from this example. Because there may be times in your life where you are lifted up on a pedestal of sorts. Or there may be times in your life where you accomplish something spiritually. You overcome sin or temptation. You help lead others to Christ. You stand for the truth. You accomplish good in the Lord's kingdom. And others may look at you and say, "That was amazing. That was great. You did such a good job." If anyone starts pointing at you, you do what Gideon does and you point to God, because that's where the strength to accomplish anything comes from. Now, Gideon remembered that in this moment. And as God's children, we need to remember that as well. Because any strength that we might have, any victory that we might achieve, it's all due to the strength that God supplies. He'd only been able to accomplish what he did because God was with him, and he knew that. You and I can only accomplish what we accomplish this side of eternity because God is with us. You know, there's one more aspect of Gideon's story that we didn't necessarily talk about this evening, and that's in Judges chapter 6. In Judges chapter 6 is probably one of the more well-known aspects of Gideon's story, in which prior to going to battle, Gideon is hesitant, to say the least. Understandably so. He is nervous. He is unsure. He is concerned. The Midianites are a powerful army. No matter how many men he may be able to assemble, he knows he's going to be outnumbered. And so he is hesitant at the outset. And in verses 36 through 40 of Judges chapter 6, we're told the story of how Gideon puts out a fleece. And he asks God a couple of different times to make that fleece wet and then to make that fleece dry. And God humors him in this moment, as Gideon is searching for some reassurance from God. God doesn't scoff at Gideon. God doesn't rebuke him for that. He offers him the reassurance that Gideon was looking for. Because both Gideon and God knew that physically, Israel was weak. Gideon and God both knew that physically, Israel was disadvantaged, and that they would lose if this was truly a battle of physical strength. They both knew that. They were both aware of that. And Gideon in that moment knew that he needed God's strength, and he needed that reassurance from God before going into battle. God does the same thing for you and I today. Now, differently than how he did it for Gideon. But he offers you and I reassurance as well. This world is a scary place. And I don't know what the future holds. I don't know what the future holds for me. I don't know what the future holds for my children. I don't know what the future holds for our country or for our world. There is a lot of uncertainty that surrounds us. But I'll tell you one thing that I am confident about. And I'm only confident about it because God reassures me of it. And that is that he is faithful. God is faithful. He is faithful to his promises. He is faithful to his people. And when I am hesitant and when I am unsure, he offers me reassurance. He offers me reassurance in the stories of Gideon. He offers me reassurance in the stories of Joshua and of Moses and of other great leaders who relied upon God's strength for victory. He reassures us through their stories and through the events that unfold in their lives. And so, like Gideon, moments in which I am hesitant, I can look at the reassurance that God provides, and I can move forward confidently. I can move forward confidently knowing that whatever may happen, I serve a God who is faithful. Whatever may happen, I serve a God who is true to the promises that he makes to his people. Whatever may happen, I serve a God who is victorious, and he has promised me the same victory. It's one of the beauties of Gideon's story, and so many like it, that when I feel my weakest, I can look into the stories of these men throughout Scripture, and I can be reassured that I serve a God who provides me with strength. If you're here this evening, maybe you feel like sin has just got a hold of you. Maybe you feel like worldliness just has a grip on you, and you just feel like there is nothing that you can do about it. If that describes you, you are right. You're right. Because there is nothing that you can do about it. But thanks be to God, He can. He can. The strength that He supplies can allow us to overcome sin. And the blood that His Son shed can allow us to be forgiven and free from that bondage. What a wonderful reassurance that is. To know that I don't have to rely on my own strength, because Christ fought the battle and He won. And now I get to stand on His shoulders, and I get to share in His victory. And I get to take advantage of the salvation that He offers. If you're here this evening and you're not a child of God, I want you to feel weak. I want you to feel disadvantaged. And I want you to feel that way because all of us need to feel the strength that can only be found in Christ. The song that you all are talking about through this whole series that you're doing, In Need, it is a plea. It is a plea from us to God because we recognize that I cannot find my own peace. I can't find my own strength. I need God's. And that's where all of us need to be. So if you're not a child of His, I want you to think about the amazing gift that is being presented. To be a child of His, to be freed from sin, to be baptized for the remission of those sins, and to be victorious through Christ. If you've done that in the past, but maybe as you think about the life that you're living, maybe you realize that you've allowed sin to creep back into your life and to get a hold of you again. We serve a patient God. We serve a long-suffering God. And we serve a God who is waiting for you to return, ready to forgive, ready to give you the strength that you need to overcome and to once again walk in unity with Him.